The fog clung to Grace Hill Cemetery like a shroud, thick and gray, swallowing the mourners' black silhouettes as they huddled around the small white casket. A piercing whine shattered the silence, followed by the thunder of paws against wet earth. Duke, a German shepherd coated in mud, burst through the mist, his eyes wild with purpose. He lunged at the casket, claws scraping the polished wood, leaving streaks of Oregon soil across its pristine surface. The crowd gasped, stumbling back as he barked, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the pines. James Bennett reached to pull him away, hands trembling, but Duke's frantic scratching intensified, as if something vital lay trapped within. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thought in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. The morning of March 27th, 2025, had dawned cold in Ashwood, Oregon, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and lingered in the lungs. The mist rolled down from the Cascades, blanketing the small town in a hush, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the cemetery's ancient firs. The mourners, nearly 50 strong, had gathered to bid farewell to Clara Bennett, an 8-year-old whose bright blue eyes and infectious laugh had once lit up their quiet streets. Now her tiny casket rested on a low platform, adorned with white roses and pink ribbons, tokens of a life cut short. Or so they believed. James Bennett stood closest to the casket, his broad shoulders hunched under a worn jacket, the lines on his weathered face carved deeper by grief. A long-haul truck driver, he'd spent years chasing horizons to keep his family afloat, but no road had prepared him for this. Beside him, Margaret Bennett clutched a crumpled tissue, her gentle hands, roughened by years at the Sunshine Laundromat, shaking as she stared at the casket. Her soft brown hair, streaked with premature gray, framed a face that hadn't smiled in months. They'd lost their miracle, their only child, and the weight of that loss pressed them into the damp earth. Pastor Henry, a stout man with thinning hair, had been midway through a prayer when Duke's arrival upended the solemnity. "Dear Lord, guide this sweet soul," he'd begun, his voice steady until the dog's sudden charge silenced him. Now he clutched his Bible, eyes darting between Duke and the mourners, unsure whether to call for order or let the moment unfold. The congregation stirred, a mix of shock and unease rippling through them. Some whispered, "Get that beast away," while others froze, captivated by the dog's raw determination. Edith Carter, an elderly widow who'd lived across from the Bennetts on Cedar Lane for decades, stood at the edge of the crowd, her silver hair tucked under a black scarf. She'd watched Clara grow, seen her skip down the street, with Duke at her heels, and now she narrowed her eyes, sensing something beyond mere chaos. Edith knew dogs. Her late husband had trained hounds, and Duke's behavior wasn't grief alone. It was purpose, sharp and undeniable, etched in the way his muscles strained against exhaustion, in the bloodshot gleam of his brown eyes. "Stop that dog!" a man shouted from the back, George Ellis, the funeral director, his voice tight with professional concern. He stepped forward, hands raised, but hesitated as Duke's whines grew louder, more insistent. The dog circled the casket, nose pressed to its seams, then reared up, planting both muddy paws on the lid. The wood creaked under his weight, and a collective gasp rose from the mourners. James moved then, his calloused hands reaching for Duke's collar, but Margaret's voice stopped him. "Let him be," she whispered, barely audible over the wind rustling the pines. Her tears fell freely now, tracing paths down her pale cheeks. He came all this way. Her words hung in the air, fragile yet heavy, as if she too felt the flickers of something unspoken in Duke's desperation. James froze, torn between his instinct to protect and a gnawing doubt that rooted him in place. Duke's claws dug deeper, scraping a jagged line across the casket's surface. The sound was harsh, grating, a violation of the sacred stillness. Yet no one moved to stop him. Not Pastor Henry, not George Ellis, not even Helen Phillips, the PTA president whose crusade had once driven Duke from Ashwood. She stood rigid, her sharp features softened by uncertainty. Her daughter Nancy clinging to her side. The girl's eyes, wide with guilt, followed Duke's every move, as if she knew something the others didn't. The fog thickened, curling around the mourners' ankles, and the air grew heavy with more than mist. It was tension, electric and alive, born of Duke's refusal to yield. He barked again, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the ground, and Edith Carter felt it in her chest, a call that transcended words. She'd seen Duke wait for Clara at the school fence, seen him guard her like a shadow. This wasn't a farewell. This was a plea. James dropped his hands, stepping back as Duke's efforts intensified. The dog's paws left bloody prints now, his pads torn from a journey no one yet understood. Margaret sank to her knees beside him, her fingers brushing his matted fur. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, her voice cracking with hope and fear. Duke turned his head, meeting her gaze with an intelligence that pierced the haze, then returned to his task, nose nudging the casket's edge as if prying at a secret. The mourners watched in stunned silence, their breaths shallow, their thoughts a tangle of disbelief and dread. Pastor Henry cleared his throat, fumbling for control, but the words wouldn't come. Edith tightened her grip on her cane, her mind racing back to tales of dogs sensing what humans missed, heartbeats beneath stillness, life beneath despair. Could it be? The question lingered, unspoken but shared, as Duke's cries grew primal, a sound of refusal that shook the small town to its core. And then, from the mist, a faint rustle emerged, the sound of footsteps, hurried and uneven. Someone was coming, someone who knew more than the gathered crowd. The story was only beginning, and Duke, with his muddy paws and unwavering heart, was its beating pulse. The rain hammered the roof of the Bennett's small rental house on Cedar Lane, a relentless drumming that mirrored the restlessness in James Bennett's chest. It was October 14th, 2022. Clara's 6th birthday, and the storm had swept in from the Pacific, turning Ashwood, Oregon, into a sodden blur of gray and green. James stood in the doorway, water dripping from his trucker's cap, cradling a soggy cardboard box he'd found abandoned by Highway 26. Inside, a German shepherd puppy shivered, its brown eyes wide with fear, its black and tan fur plastered to its tiny frame. The sight tugged at something deep within him, a memory of his own lonely nights on the road. Margaret Bennett glanced up from the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour as she shaped a lopsided birthday cake. Her gentle face softened further at the sight of the box, though worry flickered in her hazel eyes. "James, we can barely afford ourselves," she said, her voice low, mindful of Clara playing in the next room. But James shook his head, peeling off his soaked jacket to wrap the puppy tighter. "I couldn't leave him out there," he replied, his gravelly tone firm despite the exhaustion lining his weathered features. He'd driven straight through the night to make it home for Clara's birthday, and now this trembling creature felt like a gift fate had thrust upon him. Clara's laughter floated in then, bright and clear, cutting through the tension like sunlight through the storm. She bounded into the kitchen, her blue eyes sparkling, her chestnut curls bouncing as she clapped her hands at the sight of the cake. "Is it ready, Mama?" she asked, then stopped short, spotting the box in her father's arms. "Daddy, what's that?" Her voice rose with curiosity, and before James could answer, she peeked inside. The puppy lifted its head, meeting her gaze, and in that instant, an invisible thread wove itself between them, a bond as tangible as the rain-soaked air. "Oh, he's perfect!" Clara squealed, reaching out with small, eager hands. James knelt, setting the box on the worn linoleum floor, and the puppy stumbled toward her, tail wagging weakly. Margaret watched, her reservations melting as Clara giggled, cradling the pup against her patched sweater. "His name's Duke," Clara declared, her tone decisive. "Like Duke the Brave from my storybook. He's gonna be my knight." James chuckled, a rare sound that warmed the cramped room, and even Margaret's lips curved into a reluctant smile. She knew that look in her daughter's eyes, pure, unwavering love, and it was a force she couldn't fight. The house on Cedar Lane was modest, its walls patched with years of care and compromise. James's long-haul routes kept the rent paid, but the miles etched premature gray into his dark hair and left his hands rough as pine bark. Margaret's double shifts at the Sunshine Laundromat kept food on the table, her fingers perpetually chapped from detergent and hot water. They'd weathered infertility, financial strain, and the quiet ache of a small-town life, but Clara, born after years of hope, had been their miracle. Her arrival had filled their home with joy, her laughter a balm for every late-night worry. And now Duke had stumbled into that fragile light. Edith Carter, peering through her lace curtains across the street, saw the glow of the Bennetts' kitchen window through the rain. She'd known James since he was a boy, watched him grow into a man who carried too much on his shoulders. She'd seen Margaret transform from a shy newlywed into a mother whose strength held their family together. And Clara, sweet Clara, had won Edith's heart with her drawings of leaves and flowers, slipped under the widow's door on crisp fall mornings. Now, as Edith sipped her tea, she smiled faintly, sensing that the puppy's arrival marked a turning point, though she couldn't yet name it. Inside, the birthday unfolded with simple joy. Margaret lit 6 candles on the cake, their flames flickering against the damp chill seeping through the walls. Clara blew them out in one triumphant puff, her wish unspoken but shimmering in her eyes as she glanced at Duke. The puppy, warmed by James's jacket and a bowl of milk Margaret scrounged from their sparse fridge, curled up at Clara's feet, already her shadow. James sat heavily at the table, his large frame dwarfing the rickety chair, and watched his daughter with a tenderness he rarely showed. "He's yours, kiddo," he said, ruffling her curls, "but you gotta take care of him." "I will, Daddy," Clara promised, her voice solemn beyond her years. She scooped Duke into her lap, oblivious to the mud smearing her clothes, and began whispering secrets to him, plans of adventures through Ashwood's pine forests, of knights and princesses under Oregon's vast skies. Margaret exchanged a look with James, a silent agreement passing between them. They couldn't afford much, but they could afford this small living piece of happiness for their girl. Walter Hayes, James's gruff trucking buddy, had warned him against it earlier that night over the CB radio. "A dog's just another mouth to feed, Bennett," he'd crackled through the static. His voice edged with the cynicism of a man who'd seen too many hard winters. "You're stretched thin as it is." James had shrugged it off then, but now, watching Clara and Duke, he felt the weight of Walter's words settle uneasily in his gut. Still, he pushed it aside. This was Clara's day, and the puppy's trusting eyes mirrored the hope he saw in her, a hope he hadn't felt in years. The rain eased as night fell, leaving a quiet patter against the windows. Clara fell asleep on the couch. Duke nestled against her, his breathing soft and steady. Margaret draped a blanket over them, her fingers lingering on Clara's cheek, then joined James at the kitchen table. "We'll make it work," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her eyes. James nodded, his hand finding hers across the scarred wood. They didn't know it then, but Duke's arrival was more than a birthday gift. It was the beginning of a bond that would test their family, their town, and the very limits of loyalty. Across the street, Edith set her teacup down, her thoughts drifting to the years ahead. She'd seen enough of life to know that love, even the purest kind, often came with a price. As the lights in the Bennett house dimmed, she whispered a prayer into the dark, not for the puppy, but for the little girl who'd claimed him in the trials that waited just beyond the horizon. Spring had painted Ashwood, Oregon, in tender shades of green by April 2024. The pine trees around the elementary school swaying gently in a breeze that carried the scent of damp earth. At the edge of the playground, where the chain-link fence met a cluster of towering evergreens, Clara Bennett, now 8, pressed her small hands against the metal, her blue eyes scanning the familiar path beyond. Duke sat patiently on the other side, his German shepherd ears pricked, his tail sweeping the grass in a slow, steady rhythm. Recess was their daily ritual, a fleeting 15 minutes when Clara could slip away from her classmates and share whispers with her best friend through the gaps in the wire. The schoolyard buzzed with children's laughter, but not all of it was kind. Nancy Phillips, a 5th grader with sharp features and a sharper tongue, had been watching Clara for weeks. Her neatly pressed clothes and the confidence of her mother's PTA influence set her apart from Clara's patched hand-me-downs and quiet demeanor. "Look at her," Nancy sneered to her 2 friends. Their heads bent close as they lounged by the swings. "Talking to that filthy dog again. What a freak." The girls giggled, their voices slicing through the air, but Clara didn't turn. She'd learned to ignore them, clutching her mother's advice close. "Kill them with kindness, sweetheart." That Tuesday afternoon, though, kindness wasn't enough. Clara clutched her sketchbook. Pages filled with pencil drawings of Duke bounding through Ashwood's forests, his knightly courage captured in her childish strokes. Nancy spotted it, her eyes glinting with mischief as she sauntered over, her cronies trailing behind. "What's that, dog girl?" she taunted, snatching the book from Clara's hands before she could react. Clara's heart sank as Nancy flipped through it, her laughter growing crueler with each page. "She writes to her mutt like he's a person. Pathetic. Please give it back," Clara whispered, her voice trembling as she reached out. Nancy smirked, stepping toward the old pond hidden behind the pines, a murky, forbidden pool the teachers couldn't see from their perch by the school doors. With a flick of her wrist, she tore out a drawing of Duke and tossed it into the water. The paper floated briefly, then sank, ink bleeding into the dark. Tears stung Clara's eyes as Nancy ripped another, then another, scattering them like fallen leaves. "Oops," she said, her friends cackling as they formed a tight circle around Clara. Desperation surged through Clara. She lunged for the book as her small frame propelled by a need to save what was hers. Nancy sidestepped at the last moment, and Clara's momentum carried her forward. Her foot slipped on the muddy bank, and with a cry, she tumbled headfirst into the cold, deep water. The pond swallowed her fast, its surface rippling as she flailed, then vanished beneath it. Nancy froze, her smirk fading into panic, her friends' laughter dying in their throats. Duke sensed it before anyone else. From his spot beyond the fence, his ears shot up, his body tensing as Clara's cry reached him. With a single, powerful leap, he cleared the 4-foot barrier, his paws pounding the playground as he bolted toward the trees. Ruth Morgan, Clara's teacher, spotted him from across the yard, her whistle shrill as she shouted, "Stop that dog!" But Duke was a blur of fur and instinct disappearing into the pines. The other children turned, some pointing, others gaping, as the massive German shepherd plunged into the pond without hesitation. Under the water, Clara resurfaced once, gasping, her arms thrashing before the current pulled her down again. Duke dove deep, his strong jaws closing around her sweater collar. Seconds stretched into an eternity as the pond churned, the crowd holding its breath. Then, with a mighty heave, Duke broke the surface, dragging Clara onto the bank. She lay still, soaked and pale, her chest barely rising. Nancy and her friends stood rooted, horror replacing their bravado as teachers raced over, walkie-talkies crackling with calls for help. In her daze, Clara stirred, coughing up water, her limbs flailing weakly. One wild swing caught Duke above the eye, a sharp elbow splitting his skin. Blood trickled down his face, matting his fur, but he didn't flinch. He stayed by her side, his warm bulk pressed against her, his whimpers soft and steady as Ruth knelt to check her pulse. "Stay with me, Clara," Ruth urged, her voice shaking as she fumbled with first aid. The ambulance's distant wail grew louder, cutting through the chaos. Whispers spread like wildfire among the gathering crowd. "That dog attacked her," a boy muttered, misreading Duke's bloodied face. "No, he pushed her in," another insisted, fear twisting the truth. Nancy, pale and trembling, said nothing, her eyes darting to her friends as they edged away. Across town, James Bennett gripped the wheel of his rig, oblivious to the storm brewing, while Margaret folded sheets at the laundromat, a sudden chill running down her spine she couldn't explain. Edith Carter, sipping tea on her porch, heard the sirens and frowned. She'd seen Duke wait for Clara every day, his loyalty a quiet constant in Ashwood's rhythm. Now, as the ambulance sped toward the school, she set her cup down, her mind turning to the sketchbook Clara had once shown her. Pages of a knightly dog who'd never let her fall. But fall she had, and the truth of that moment was already slipping beneath lies, dark and murky as the pond itself. The playground emptied as teachers herded students inside, leaving Duke tethered to a post by the janitor's makeshift leash, his gaze fixed on the ambulance's fading lights, his whine carried on the wind, a sound of distress, of love, of something unfinished. In Ashwood, the day shifted, its peaceful spring veneer cracking open to reveal the fault lines beneath. Clara's rescue was only the beginning, and Duke's bloodied vigil marked the edge of a deeper descent. The late spring sun dipped below the Cascades, casting long shadows over Ashwood, Oregon, as the echoes of the ambulance siren faded into the dusk of April, 2024. Inside the principal's office at Ashwood Elementary, the air was thick with tension, the faint hum of a fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Charles Lawson sat behind his cluttered desk, his balding head gleaming with sweat, his fingers tapping nervously on a stack of incident reports. Before him stood James Bennett, still in his trucker's jacket, his broad frame rigid with barely contained fury. Margaret Bennett hovered by his side, her laundromat apron crumpled in her hands. Her eyes red from a day of worry turned to dread. "She's alive because of him," James growled, his voice rough as gravel, pointing toward the playground where Duke sat tethered to a post, his bloodied face a silent testament to the afternoon's chaos. "Clara told us. Nancy pushed her, and Duke saved her. Why's my dog the one in trouble?" Charles shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking to the window where parents milled outside, their voices a low murmur of outrage and fear. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as if it could shield him from the truth he didn't want to face. "Mr. Bennett, I understand your position," Charles began, his tone measured but brittle. "But several students reported seeing Duke act aggressively before Clara fell. We've got parents calling the school board, demanding action. His presence here, it's become a liability." The words landed like stones, each one sinking deeper into James's chest. Margaret stepped forward, her gentle voice trembling with conviction. "Clara's not lying. She's in the hospital, bruised and scared, begging for Duke. You can't take him away from her now." Across town, Helen Phillips paced her pristine living room, her sharp heels clicking against hardwood floors. Nancy sat on the couch, her knees drawn up, her face pale as she twisted a strand of blonde hair around her finger. "You didn't mean it, honey," Helen said, her voice firm with maternal certainty. "You were just playing, and that dog overreacted. We'll make sure everyone knows." Nancy nodded mutely, her guilt a tight knot she couldn't untangle. But her mother's influence was a lifeline she clung to. Helen had already called half the PTA, spinning a tale of a dangerous animal loose on school grounds, her words fanning the flames of panic. Back at the school, the janitor's makeshift leash creaked as Duke strained toward the direction Clara had been taken, his whines cutting through the evening chill. Ruth Morgan lingered nearby, her whistle dangling uselessly around her neck. She'd seen Duke leap the fence, seen him pull Clara from the pond, but the swirl of rumors had drowned her quiet protests. "He's not dangerous," she murmured to herself, but no one listened. The truth was slipping away, buried beneath fear and Helen's calculated whispers. Charles sighed, pulling a letter from his desk drawer. A formal notice from the school board, its edges crisp with authority. "I'm sorry, folks," he said, avoiding James's glare. "The board's decision is final. Duke can't come near the school anymore, and there's more. Your insurance company called. They'll cancel your homeowner's policy if you keep him. You've got 10 days to comply, or it's legal action." Margaret's breath caught, her hands clenching the apron tighter. James slammed a fist on the desk, the sound reverberating through the small room. "This is bullshit," he spat. "You're punishing a hero." The drive home was silent, the pickup truck's engine rumbling through Ashwood's narrow streets. Clara lay in a hospital bed at Ashwood General, released that evening with a clean bill of health, but a heart heavy with loss. She'd sobbed into Margaret's arms, her small voice pleading, "He saved me, Mama. Nancy pushed me, not Duke." But the world beyond her hospital room didn't care. James gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, while Margaret stared out at the passing pines, her mind racing for a solution they didn't have. They couldn't move. James's roots and Margaret's shifts tied them to Ashwood. Homeschooling was a dream beyond their means. Edith Carter watched their truck pull into the driveway from her porch, her silver hair catching the last light of day. She'd heard the sirens, seen the flurry of activity at the school, and pieced together enough from neighbors' gossip to know trouble had found the Bennets again. Edith had no children of her own, but Clara's drawings and Duke's faithful vigils had woven them into her quiet life. She frowned, sensing the injustice settling over Cedar Lane like a fog, and opened her journal to a fresh page, her pen poised to record what others might forget. James made the call that night, his voice heavy as he spoke to Frank Dawson, an old Army buddy who ran a small farm 50 miles away in Sisters, Oregon. "Can you take him, Frank?" he asked, staring at Duke, curled up by Clara's bedside, the gash above his eye scabbing over. Frank's gruff reply crackled through the line. "Sure, Jim. He'll be safe here till you figure this out." Clara stirred awake, her eyes widening in panic. "No, Daddy, please!" she cried, clutching Duke's fur. Margaret knelt beside her, tears spilling as she whispered, "It's just for now, sweetheart. We'll bring him back." But the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. The insurance deadline loomed, a guillotine over their fragile life. James hung up, his shoulders slumping as he met Clara's gaze, those blue eyes once so bright now clouded with betrayal. Duke whimpered, sensing the shift, his head resting in Clara's lap as if to anchor her to him. Across the street, Edith wrote, "They took her night away tonight, and with him a piece of her soul." The next morning, Frank's red pickup rolled into Ashwood, dust trailing behind it. Clara clung to Duke until James gently pried her away, her sobs echoing through the yard. Duke went willingly, his training holding firm, but at the truck's tailgate he turned back, his eyes locking with Clara's in a look of such sorrow that even Frank, hardened by years of farm life, had to look away. As the truck disappeared down Cedar Lane, Clara stood frozen, her small frame trembling, and Ashwood's quiet streets bore witness to a wound that would fester in silence. Summer settled over Ashwood, Oregon in June 2024, the air heavy with the hum of cicadas and the scent of sun-warmed pines. But inside the Bennett house on Cedar Lane, the season's warmth couldn't pierce the chill that had taken root. Clara Bennett sat by the living room window, her small frame hunched in a chair too big for her. Her blue eyes fixed on the empty street beyond, the spot where Duke used to wait, tail wagging, ears perked, was now just a patch of worn grass, a silent scar on the landscape of her world. In her lap she clutched his old brush, its bristles matted with his black and tan fur, her fingers tracing it like a lifeline. Margaret Bennett moved quietly through the kitchen, her hands trembling as she flipped pancakes on the griddle. The golden stacks had once been Clara's Sunday favorite, a ritual that filled their modest home with laughter. Now they sat untouched on the table, growing cold as Clara pushed them away with a listless hand. "I'm not hungry, Mama," she murmured, her voice a faint echo of the girl who'd once giggled over Duke's playful nudges. Margaret's heart ached as she watched her daughter fade, the dark circles under Clara's eyes deepening with each passing day. She forced a smile, her chapped fingers brushing Clara's curls. "Just a bite, sweetheart. For me." James Bennett lingered in the doorway, his trucker's jacket slung over one shoulder, his weathered face etched with guilt. He'd been home more since the pond incident, cutting routes short to keep an eye on Clara, but it wasn't enough. The sight of her, once so vibrant, now a shadow, gnawed at him. He'd failed her, let the school and the insurance company rip Duke away, and the weight of that choice pressed harder than any midnight drive. "She's not eating again," he said to Margaret, low enough that Clara wouldn't hear, though her stillness suggested she wasn't listening anyway. Margaret nodded, her lips tight, her mind racing for a way to pull their girl back from the edge. Across the street, Edith Carter sat on her porch, her silver hair glinting in the morning light as she opened her journal. She'd watched Clara unravel since Duke's departure, each day a quiet subtraction from the child she'd known. The drawings had stopped. No more leaves or flowers slipped under her door. Instead, Clara's world had shrunk to that window, her vigil a mirror of the one Duke had kept for her at the school fence. Edith's pen scratched across the page. She's waiting for him, but he's 50 miles away, and I fear she's losing more than hope. Her eyes, sharp despite her years, caught the slump in James's shoulders as he stepped outside, lighting a cigarette he rarely smoked anymore. Clara's decline wasn't just emotional, it was physical, a slow unraveling that crept into her bones. She'd always been slight, but now her clothes hung loose, her once rosy cheeks hollowed out. Margaret noticed it first, the way Clara's steps faltered on the stairs, the way she'd pause to catch her breath after crossing the room. James saw it too in the tremble of her hands when she reached for Duke's brush, a gesture so automatic it broke his heart every time. "She's not sick," Margaret whispered one night, her voice cracking as they sat at the kitchen table, bills piling up beside them. "She's grieving him." The town whispered about it too, though few dared speak to the Bennets directly. At the Sunshine Laundromat, Margaret overheard snippets, customers clucking their tongues, saying Clara was too attached to that dog, that she'd bounce back soon enough. But they didn't see her at night, waking from dreams of Duke with tears soaking her pillow, calling his name in a voice so soft it barely reached the walls. They didn't see James pacing the garage, tools clattering as he tried to fix what couldn't be mended, or Margaret counting pennies to keep the lights on, her shift stretching longer to cover the void Duke's absence had left. Edith knew better. She'd lived through loss, her husband, her dogs, the slow fade of Ashwood's old ways, and recognized the signs. Clara wasn't just missing Duke. She was losing herself to the space he'd filled. One afternoon, Edith crossed the street, her cane tapping the pavement, and knocked on the Bennets' door. Margaret answered, her apron dusted with flour, her eyes wary. "I've seen it before," Edith said, her voice steady but kind. "She needs him back, or something's gonna give." Margaret nodded, too tired to argue, but the weight of their situation, the insurance, the school's ban, hung between them like a locked gate. Clara stirred then, her head lifting as if she'd heard Edith's words. "He's my knight," she said, her gaze drifting back to the window, her fingers tightening on the brush. "He promised to stay." The words cut deeper than Margaret could bear, a child's faith clashing with a world that didn't bend. James stepped inside, catching the tail end of the exchange, and his jaw tightened. He'd promised her too. Promised they'd bring Duke back. But every call to Frank Dawson ended the same. "He's safe, Jim, but he's not eating much. Keeps watching the road." That night, Clara climbed into bed, Duke's brush tucked beside her pillow like a talisman. Margaret sat by her side, humming a lullaby she hadn't sung since Clara was a baby, her voice trembling as Clara's breathing slowed. James stood in the hall, his silhouette dark against the dim light, listening to the quiet that wasn't peace, but surrender. Across the street, Edith closed her journal, her final entry stark. "The silence is swallowing her whole. And I don't know if we can pull her out." The summer days stretched on, each one a mirror of the last, until Clara's vigil by the window became a fixture in Ashwood's rhythm. But beneath her stillness something was shifting, her body weakening, her spirit retreating to a place where Duke still waited. The Bennets didn't see it yet, but the thread tying Clara to life was fraying, and the next unraveling would shake their world to its core. The fall of 2024 draped Ashwood, Oregon, in a muted palette of amber and rust, the pines along Cedar Lane shedding needles that crunched underfoot. Inside the Bennett house, the air was stale, heavy, with the scent of untouched meals and the faint tang of despair. Clara Bennett lay on the couch, a thin blanket pulled over her frail frame, her blue eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The window she'd once haunted stood empty now. She hadn't the strength to sit there anymore. Her chestnut curls clung damply to her forehead, and her breathing came in shallow rasps, a sound that pierced Margaret Bennett's heart with every exhale. Margaret hovered nearby, a tray of soup trembling in her hands. She'd spent the morning at the Sunshine Laundromat, her shift cut short when the school nurse called. Clara had fainted during recess, her small body crumpling onto the playground gravel. Now, at Ashwood General Hospital's emergency room, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on Clara's pale face. Dr. Paul Grayson, a wiry man with kind eyes and a furrowed brow, leaned over her, his stethoscope cold against her chest. "Her immune system's compromised," he said, his voice low as he met Margaret's gaze. "She's not fighting off infections like she should." "Has there been any big stress lately?" Margaret's throat tightened, her chapped fingers clutching the tray's edge until it bit into her skin. "Her dog," she whispered, tears spilling over. "They took Duke away months ago, and she's been fading ever since." James Bennett stood by the curtained partition, his trucker's cap twisted in his hands, his broad shoulders slumped as if bearing the weight of the hospital itself. He'd raced from a delivery in Bend when Margaret called, the panic in her voice cutting through the static of his radio. "She's grieving," he said, his gravelly tone cracking. "But it's more than that, isn't it?" Dr. Grayson nodded, scribbling notes on a chart. "Depression can hit kids hard, physically too. Her body shutting down, low weight, weak vitals. We'll run tests, but she needs rest and care." He paused, his eyes softening. "And maybe something to fight for." The words hung in the air, a quiet indictment of the emptiness Duke's absence had carved into Clara's life. Margaret sank into a plastic chair, her mind replaying the months of Clara's decline. The untouched pancakes, the sleepless nights, the way her daughter's laughter had vanished like a ghost. Across town, Edith Carter sat at her kitchen table, her journal open to a page stained with tea. She'd seen the ambulance from her porch, watched James's truck tear down Cedar Lane, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. "She's slipping away," she wrote, her pen trembling slightly. "That dog was her anchor, and without him she's adrift." Edith had no medical training, but she'd lived long enough to know the soul could break the body. She'd tried to warn Margaret, but words couldn't undo the chains of bureaucracy and fear that had stolen Duke. 50 miles away, in Sisters, Oregon, Frank Dawson knelt by a wooden fence, his weathered hands offering a bowl of kibble to Duke. The German shepherd lay in the grass, his once magnificent frame thinned, his brown eyes fixed on the road winding toward Ashwood. "Come on, boy," Frank urged, his gruff voice softening. "You gotta eat." But Duke barely lifted his head, his tail still, his appetite lost to the same longing that gnawed at Clara. Frank stood, rubbing his neck, and dialed James. "He's not doing good, Jim," he said when James picked up from the hospital. He's watching for her, same as she's watching for him. James gripped the phone, his knuckles whitening as Frank's words sank in. "She's in the hospital, Frank," he said, his voice hollow. "Fainted today. They say she's sick, but it's him. She needs him." Margaret looked up, catching the tail end, and her breath hitched. The parallel suffering of Clara and Duke was a thread stretching across the miles, a bond neither distance nor time could sever. "Keep him safe," James added, hanging up as a nurse wheeled Clara to a private room, her small hand limp against the gurney. The hospital room was stark, its white walls a cold contrast to the warmth Clara had once known. Machines beeped softly, tracking her faltering pulse, while Margaret sat vigil, her apron discarded on a chair. James paced, his boots scuffing the linoleum, his mind racing for a way out of this nightmare. Outside, Ashwood stirred. Word of Clara's collapse spread through the laundromat, the diner, the gas station. Some clucked sympathetically, others muttered about "that dangerous dog," their voices a chorus of division. Helen Phillips, sipping coffee at the PTA meeting, dismissed it with a wave. "She'll be fine," she said, though doubt flickered in her sharp eyes. Edith, though, saw the truth. She hobbled to the hospital that evening, her cane tapping a determined rhythm, and slipped a note under Clara's door. "Hold on, little one. Knights don't abandon their princesses." She didn't stay. The sight of Clara hooked to tubes was too much, but her words lingered, a faint spark in the dark as Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring Duke's name. Margaret heard it, her tears falling onto the blanket while James stopped pacing, his fists clenched. "We've got to fix this," he said, his voice breaking. "She's slipping away." The test came back late that night. Clara's immune system was failing, her body too weak to fend off even a cold. Dr. Grayson pulled Margaret aside, his face grave. "It's stress, grief. It's systemic. She's not just sick. She's giving up." The diagnosis was a knife, twisting deeper into the Bennetts' fragile hope. As midnight crept in, Clara's fever spiked, her breathing grew ragged, and the storm within her raged on, unseen but relentless. Across the miles, Duke lifted his head, a low whine escaping him as if he felt it too, a call to action that would soon break every chain holding him back. The late fall rain lashed Sisters, Oregon, on a stormy night in November 2024, the wind howling through the pines like a mournful song. At Frank Dawson's farm, 50 miles from Ashwood, Duke lay by the wooden fence, his German shepherd frame gaunt against the sodden earth. The bowl of kibble Frank had left sat untouched, rain pooling around it, as Duke's brown eyes stared down the muddy road toward the horizon. His once proud coat was matted with neglect, his ribs stark beneath thinning fur. But a spark flickered in his gaze, a restless, unyielding pull that had grown stronger with each passing hour. Frank stood under the barn's overhang, his grizzled face etched with worry as he watched Duke through the downpour. He'd called James earlier that day, hearing the strain in his old friend's voice. Clara was worse, her fever climbing, her small body fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. "He's fading too, Jim," Frank had said, his gruff tone softening, like he knows she's slipping. Now, as lightning split the sky, Frank saw Duke rise, his ears twitching, his head tilting, as if catching a sound beyond the storm. Before Frank could move, Duke lunged at the fence, his weakened body finding strength in desperation. The old wood splintered under his weight, and he was gone, a shadow swallowed by the rain. The road stretched dark and treacherous. Highway 26, a ribbon of asphalt winding through Oregon's wild heart. Duke ran, his paws pounding the earth, blood seeping from cuts torn open by the fence. The storm battered him. Rain stung his eyes, wind tugged at his fur. But he pressed on, guided by an instinct deeper than hunger or pain. 50 miles lay between him and Clara, a distance that would break most, but Duke was no ordinary dog. He was her knight, her shadow, and the thread tying them together pulled taut across the miles, a lifeline he refused to let snap. In Ashwood, Clara lay in her hospital bed, the beep of monitors a faint counterpoint to the storm rattling the windows. Her fever burned hot, her small chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Margaret Bennett sat beside her, her hands clasped tight, her chapped fingers tracing the edge of Clara's blanket. James paced the room, his boots scuffing the linoleum, his trucker's cap crumpled in his fist. "She's worse," Dr. Paul Grayson had warned them that evening, his voice heavy. "Her body's not responding." Margaret's tears fell silently, her mind clinging to Frank's call. Duke wasn't eating either, as if their fates were entwined. Outside, the town buzzed with whispers of Clara's decline, the storm amplifying its unease. Edith Carter sat at her kitchen table, her journal open, her pen scratching out her fears. She's fighting a storm inside, and he's out there, running through one to reach her. She'd heard the nurses gossip at the hospital, seen the weight on James's shoulders, and felt the shift in Ashwood's rhythm. The community was splitting. Some, like Helen Phillips, clung to their fear of Duke, while others began to question the banishment, their voices soft but growing. Along Highway 26, Duke's journey became a spectacle of nature and will. Truckers spotted him. Through rain-streaked windshields, their CB radios crackling with reports. "That's the Bennett girl's dog," one muttered, slowing his rig as Duke darted across the road, a blur of determination. Another left a water bottle by a rest stop, its cap loosened for the weary traveler. Officer Daniel Reese, patrolling the outskirts, caught sight of him near mile marker 42. His orders were clear. Duke was a restricted animal, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd seen Clara in the hospital, her small hand clutching air where Duke should have been. Instead of chasing, he radioed in a vague update. "Just ensuring public safety," and trailed at a distance, headlights dimmed, leaving scraps of his lunch along the route. Duke's strength waned as the miles piled up, his limp growing pronounced, his breath ragged against the cold. Yet pressed on, pausing only to drink from a roadside stream, its icy flow a brief reprieve. The rain lessened near dawn, the sky lightening to a bruised gray, and Duke reached the outskirts of Ashwood, his paws bleeding but his spirit unbroken. Local residents began to notice, a farmer on his tractor, a kid peering from a car window, each sighting rippling through the town like a current. "That's Duke," the farmer muttered, dialing the hospital. "He's coming home." In her hospital room, Clara stirred, her fevered mind adrift in dreams of Duke bounding through the pines. Her heart rate spiked, a sudden jolt on the monitor that made Margaret gasp. "She's restless," Dr. Grayson noted, checking her chart, his brow furrowing. "Something's agitating her." Margaret leaned closer, whispering, "Hold on, baby," as if Clara could hear. James stopped pacing, his eyes darting to the window where rain streaked the glass. He didn't know Duke was out there, but a flicker of hope stirred in his chest. A father's instinct mirroring the dog's. Edith felt it too, hobbling to her porch as the first light broke. She'd written of knights and princesses, of bonds that defied logic, and now she sensed the story turning. Across the miles, Duke crossed Ashwood's limits, his nose lifting to catch the faint scent of home, of Clara. He veered off the highway, sticking to familiar paths, the school, the park, the old routes he'd walked with her. His pace quickened despite the pain, his will a beacon cutting through the storm's aftermath. The hospital loomed ahead, its lights a distant glow, and Duke's journey neared its end. But the town wasn't ready. Not the school board, not Helen Phillips, not the rules that had caged him. As he neared Grace Street, his bloody paws left prints on the wet pavement, a trail of devotion that would soon collide with Ashwood's divided heart. Clara's fight hung in the balance, and Duke's race against the rain was her last fragile hope. The dawn of November 15th, 2024 broke over Ashwood, Oregon, with a fragile stillness, the storm's last raindrops clinging to the hospital windows like tears. Duke staggered into the parking lot of Ashwood General, his German shepherd frame a shadow of its former strength, ribs jutting, paws bloodied from a 50-mile trek through the night. His brown eyes burned with purpose, though, as he slipped past a delivery truck, his nose guiding him through the maze of corridors. The night staff barely noticed, bleary-eyed from their shifts, until he reached the pediatric wing, his muddy prints trailing a path of determination. Inside, room 204, Clara Bennett lay motionless, her small body dwarfed by the hospital bed, her chestnut curls splayed across the pillow. Machines beeped a steady, mournful rhythm, tracking her fevered pulse. Margaret Bennett sat hunched in a chair, her hands clasped tight, her face etched with exhaustion after a sleepless night. James Bennett stood by the window, his trucker's cap discarded, his gaze lost in the gray dawn. Dr. Paul Grayson had left an hour ago, his warning still ringing in their ears. "She's slipping fast. We're doing all we can." The words had hollowed them out, leaving only the faint hope that Clara's night might somehow ride back into her story. Duke's arrival was a whisper at first, a soft whimper, a nudge of a wet nose against the door. Margaret's head snapped up, her breath catching as the sound pierced the silence. James turned, his broad frame tensing, and before either could speak, Duke pushed through, his limp pronounced, but his will unbroken. He crossed the room in 3 strides, leaping onto the bed with a grace that belied his exhaustion. His warm bulk settled beside Clara, his head resting on her chest, and a low, keening whine escaped him. A sound of relief, of homecoming. "Duke!" Margaret gasped, tears spilling as she reached for him, her fingers sinking into his matted fur. James stumbled forward, his voice rough with disbelief. "How the hell?" But the question died as Clara stirred, her eyelids fluttering, her small hand twitching toward Duke. Her lips parted, a faint Duke escaping, and the monitor's beeps quickened, a jolt of life surging through her fragile frame. Margaret sobbed openly now, her hands trembling as she stroked Clara's cheek while James sank to his knees beside the bed, his calloused fingers brushing Duke's bloodied paws. Nurse Lillian Hayes, drawn by the commotion, paused in the doorway, her clipboard forgotten. She'd cared for Clara through too many nights, seen her fade with each passing day. Now her eyes widened at the sight, Duke curled protectively around the girl, his presence a defiance of hospital rules. "He shouldn't be here," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. She'd heard the rumors of his journey, felt the weight of Clara's longing in every whispered call for him. Instead of calling security, she stepped back, closing the door with a quiet click, her own tears welling as she bent the rules for a miracle she couldn't deny. For 3 days Duke stayed, a constant by Clara's side. The hospital staff, moved by the transformation, turned a blind eye. Lillian smuggled in water bowls. Dr. Grayson adjusted charts to avoid questions. Clara's fever broke the first morning. Her breathing steadied and color crept back into her cheeks. She woke fully on the second day, her blue eyes meeting Duke's with a smile that lit the room. "You came back," she whispered, her voice weak but alive, her fingers threading through his fur. Margaret laughed through tears, feeding her soup. Clara finally ate, while James sat close, his gruff exterior softened by relief. Ashwood buzzed with the news. Duke's return rippled through the diner, the laundromat, the gas station. Edith Carter visiting with a new note. He found her, against all odds, smiled as she saw Clara sit up sketching Duke on a hospital pad. Officer Daniel Reese, who'd shadowed Duke's journey, tipped his hat from the hall, his quiet pride unspoken. Even Helen Phillips, sipping tea at home, faltered, her certainty shaken by whispers of the dog's devotion. The town's divide deepened. Some saw a hero, others a threat, but for the Bennets, it was a reprieve, a fragile bloom of hope in a season of loss. But the joy was short-lived. On the third night, as the clock ticked toward dawn, Clara's fever spiked again, sudden and fierce. Lillian found her burning up, her small body trembling despite the cool room. Duke sensed it first, his head lifting, a distressed bark shattering the quiet. "Something's wrong," Clara murmured, her hand clutching his fur, her voice fading as her eyes fluttered shut. Margaret's cry brought the staff running. Dr. Grayson, still in his coat from a late call, rushed in, his face grim as he checked her vitals. "She's crashing," he said, his voice tight. "We need to move her to ICU." The room erupted in chaos. Nurses wheeled the bed out, monitors blaring as Clara's heart rate plummeted. Duke leapt down, his barks echoing through the halls, but security grabbed him, their hands firm despite his struggles. "Don't let them take him," Clara pleaded, her words slurring as the gurney rolled away, her last conscious breath a gasp of fear. Margaret stumbled after her, James following, their world collapsing anew. Duke's howls filled the corridor, a primal sound of loss as he was dragged outside, his eyes locked on the ICU doors slamming shut. Edith, watching from the waiting room, felt her heart sink. She'd seen the spark in Clara's eyes, the life Duke had brought back, and now it was slipping away again. Across town, Frank Dawson, alerted by a nurse's call, started his truck, knowing Duke's journey wasn't over. The hospital settled into an uneasy hush, the Bennets clinging to each other in the ICU waiting area, their hope dangling by a thread. Clara's fight hung in the balance, and Duke's cries outside were a call to a truth still hidden, a truth that would soon demand to be heard. The morning of March 27th, 2025, dawned cold and misty over Grace Hill Cemetery in Ashwood, Oregon, the fog weaving through the pines like a mourner's veil. Clara Bennett's small white casket rested on a low platform, surrounded by white roses and pink ribbons, its polished surface gleaming faintly under the overcast sky. The crowd swelled beyond the chapel's walls, nearly 100 strong, their black coats blending into the haze. James Bennett stood at the front, his broad frame diminished by grief, his trucker's hands clenched at his sides. Margaret Bennett leaned against him, her face hollowed by sleepless nights, her gentle hands clutching a sketch Clara had drawn of Duke, now creased and tear-stained. Pastor Henry's voice trembled as he began the service, his Bible open to a passage he couldn't bring himself to read. "We gather to honor a light taken too soon," he said, faltering as the weight of the moment pressed down. The hospital had declared Clara gone after her collapse 5 days ago, her heart stopping in the ICU despite desperate efforts. The Bennetts had moved through the preparations like sleepwalkers, arranging the funeral with a numbness that dulled the world's edges. Duke, sent back to Frank Dawson's farm after his removal from the hospital, was 50 miles away, or so they thought. Edith Carter stood at the crowd's edge, her silver hair tucked under a scarf, her cane planted firmly in the damp earth. She'd watched Clara fade, seen Duke's fleeting reunion reignite her spark, only to lose her again. Her journal, tucked in her coat, held the story. Her night came back, but the castle fell anyway. Now, as she scanned the mourners, she felt a prickle of unease, a sense that the tale wasn't finished. Helen Phillips stood nearby, her sharp features softened by uncertainty, her daughter Nancy clinging to her side, eyes downcast with a guilt she couldn't voice. The service proceeded with hymns, their notes swallowed by the fog, but a murmur rippled through the crowd as a distant sound broke the stillness, paws thudding against wet grass. Heads turned, breaths held, as Duke burst from the mist, his German shepherd form a battered silhouette. His fur was matted with mud, his paws bloodied anew from another escape, but his eyes blazed with a ferocity that stopped the mourners cold. He charged the casket, leaping onto the platform with a force that rocked it, his claws scraping the wood as he barked, a deep, urgent sound that echoed through the pines. "Get him off!" George Ellis, the funeral director, shouted, stepping forward with a mix of shock and duty. But James held up a hand, his voice raw. "Wait." Margaret sank to her knees, her sob breaking free as Duke circled the casket, his nose pressing to its seams, his whines rising into a plea. "He's here again," she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for him. Duke reared up, paws slamming against the lid, leaving bloody prints that smeared the roses. The crowd split. Some recoiled, others leaned in, captivated by the dog's desperation. Pastor Henry fumbled for words, his prayer forgotten. "This isn't right," he muttered, but no one moved to stop Duke. Edith's eyes narrowed, her mind racing to tales of dogs, sensing life where humans saw death. Across the chapel, Dr. Robert Klein, a retired ER doctor who'd come to pay respects, watched with growing intensity. His white hair gleamed in the dim light, his arthritic hands tightening on his cane as Duke's barks grew sharper, more insistent. Something stirred in his memory. A case from decades past, a patient misjudged, a heartbeat missed. "He's trying to tell us something," Margaret said, her voice rising with a hope she couldn't suppress. She staggered to Duke's side, her fingers sinking into his fur as he pushed harder, his body trembling with effort. James joined her, his grief warring with instinct, his gaze locked on the casket. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his tone cracking as Duke's movements became frantic, his nose nudging the lid as if prying at a lock. The mourners whispered, some called for order, others held their breath, the tension thick as the fog. Helen Phillips stepped forward, her voice shaky but firm. "Let him be," she said, placing herself between George and Duke, her eyes meeting Margaret's with a flicker of atonement. Nancy clung tighter, tears spilling as she murmured, "I'm sorry," too soft for most to hear. The shift in Helen stunned the crowd. Her crusade against Duke had fueled this tragedy, yet now she stood as his defender. George hesitated, his professional resolve faltering as Duke's barks took on a primal edge, a sound that transcended grief and demanded attention. Frank Dawson arrived then, his red pickup screeching to a halt at the cemetery's edge. He'd found the broken fence at dawn, tracked Duke's path, and raced to Ashwood, his gruff voice cutting through the chaos. "Wait!" he shouted, striding forward, his boots sinking into the mud. "Something's not right here." Duke turned to him briefly, then resumed his assault, standing on hind legs, his front paws scrabbling at the lid, with a ferocity that shook the platform. The casket creaked, a faint groan of wood under pressure, and the mourners gasped as one. Dr. Klein moved closer, his medical mind clicking into gear. "I've seen this before," he muttered, his voice low but carrying weight. He'd treated patients whose vitals dropped so low they mimicked death. Rare, but real. Duke's urgency struck a chord, a possibility too wild to ignore. "He knows," Klein said louder now, his eyes meeting James's. "He knows something we don't." The words hung heavy, a spark in the fog, as Duke's barks reached a fever pitch, a desperate call that pierced Ashwood's heart and set the stage for a truth no one was ready to face. The fog at Grace Hill Cemetery thickened on March 27th, 2025, curling around the mourners like a living thing, muting the world beyond Clara Bennett's small white casket. Duke's barks reverberated through the pines, a primal rhythm that held Ashwoods gathered in a spell of awe and dread. His German shepherd paws scrabbled at the casket lid, bloody prints streaking the wood, his body trembling with an urgency that defied his exhaustion. James Bennett stood frozen, his trucker's hands hovering midair, torn between grief and the wild hope flickering in his chest. Margaret Bennett knelt beside Duke, her tears mingling with mist, her voice a broken plea. "What are you telling us, boy?" The crowd stirred, a tangle of whispers and shifting feet. Pastor Henry clutched his Bible, his authority unraveling as Duke's cries drowned his murmured protests. George Ellis, the funeral director, hovered nearby, his professional composure cracking, his hands twitching toward the casket key in his pocket. Helen Phillips stood firm, her sharp features softened by a dawning regret, shielding Duke from the elders who muttered about decorum. Nancy clung to her mother, her sobs a quiet confession of the pond incident that had spiraled into this moment. Edith Carter watched from the edge, her silver hair glinting, her journal forgotten as she leaned on her cane, sensing the story's pivot. Dr. Robert Klein pushed through the mourners, his white hair a beacon in the fog, his arthritic knees creaking as he knelt by the casket. Decades in emergency medicine sharpened his gaze as he studied Duke's relentless focus. The dog's nose pressed to the seams, his bark shifting to a high pleading whine. "I've seen this before," Klein said, his aged voice cutting through the chaos with the weight of experience. "Chicago, 1982. A boy in a coma, so deep we called it death. Machines missed it, but his dog didn't." He turned to James, his eyes bright with urgency. "Sometimes the body hides life too well." Margaret's breath hitched, her hands tightening in Duke's fur. "You mean—" she whispered, unable to finish. James stepped closer, his gravelly voice trembling. "She's gone, Doc. They checked everything." But doubt cracked his certainty, mirrored in the crowd's hush as Klein shook his head. "Not everything," he said, reaching for his old medical bag, a habit he'd never shed. "Get me a stethoscope. And open these windows. Real light, not this gloom." Mourners scrambled to obey. The chapel's stained glass swinging wide, spilling pale daylight onto the scene. Duke calmed slightly, his frantic energy shifting to a focused watchfulness, his eyes locked on Klein as if recognizing an ally. George Ellis hesitated, then produced the casket key, his voice low. "This is irregular, but—" He trailed off, guided by a force beyond protocol, and unlocked the lid with steady hands. The crowd held its breath as Klein lifted it, the hinges creaking in the silence, revealing Clara's still form, her chestnut curls framing a face too pale, her small chest unmoving beneath a white dress. Klein pressed his fingers to her neck, his brow furrowing, then leaned in with the stethoscope a nurse thrust into his hands. Seconds stretched into an eternity, the fog seeming to pulse with anticipation. Then his eyes widened, a spark igniting behind them. "Pulse," he muttered, pressing harder. "Faint, but there." A gasp rippled through the mourners, Margaret's sob breaking free as she clutched Duke tighter. Klein straightened, his voice ringing clear. "She's in a profound coma. Hibernation, not death. Machines can miss it. She's alive, and this dog knew." James staggered, his hands gripping the casket's edge, his weathered face crumpling with relief and disbelief. "Alive?" he rasped, as if testing the word. Margaret rose, her tears falling onto Clara's dress, her voice a prayer. "Oh God, she's alive!" Duke sat back, his bloody paws still, a quiet satisfaction in his gaze as if his task was done. The mourners erupted, some wept, others shouted, a chaos of joy and shock replacing the funeral's solemnity. "Ambulance now!" Klein barked, stepping back as Officer Daniel Reese, who'd followed Duke's trail, grabbed his radio. "County General, tell him it's a deep coma case like Jensen 98. Call Dr. Sarah Mitchell, neurologist." Paramedics burst through the chapel doors, their equipment clattering as they moved with practice speed. They lifted Clara from the casket to a gurney, her small form fragile but breathing, her pulse a faint promise beneath the chaos. Duke rose, limping after her, and this time no one stopped him, his place beside her unquestioned. Margaret and James followed, hands clasped, their steps unsteady but buoyed by a hope they'd thought lost. The crowd parted, some reaching out to touch Duke, others whispering apologies to the air. Helen Phillips stood silent, her crusade undone, while Nancy buried her face in her mother's coat, guilt mingling with relief. Edith Carter smiled faintly, her intuition vindicated, her cane tapping as she trailed behind, knowing her journal would need a new chapter. The ambulance sped off, sirens slicing through the fog, carrying Clara to County General, where truth would unravel further. Duke rode beside her, his head resting on her gurney, his presence a lifeline no one dared sever. At Grace Hill the mourners dispersed, their world tilted by a miracle they couldn't yet grasp. Frank Dawson lingered, his gruff voice soft as he muttered, "Damn dog did it again." But the story wasn't over. Clara's fight was just beginning, and Ashwood's reckoning loomed, a shadow cast by a dog's unwavering love. Spring sunlight filtered through the windows of County General Hospital on April 15th, 2025, casting golden patches across Clara Bennett's bed in room 312. 3 weeks had passed since the fog-shrouded miracle at Grace Hill Cemetery, and Clara lay awake now, her blue eyes tracing the ceiling tiles, her small hand resting in Duke's fur. The German shepherd curled beside her, his graying muzzle nestled against her arm, his presence a steady comfort, granted by special permission from a hospital staff still awed by his feat. Her chestnut curls framed a face regaining its color, though the frailty of her 8-year-old frame lingered, a reminder of the storm she'd weathered. Margaret Bennett sat in a chair pulled close, her gentle hands knitting a scarf, pink and white, Clara's favorite colors. her chapped fingers moving with a rhythm born of relief. James Bennett leaned against the wall, his trucker's jacket slung over a hook, his weathered face softened by a rare smile as he watched Clara sketch Duke on a pad. The hospital room buzzed with quiet life. Get-well cards from classmates lined the sill, wild flowers from the church brightened the corner, and Clara's faint hum filled the air, a melody she'd once sung with Duke in their Cedar Lane yard. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the neurologist summoned from Portland, stood at the foot of the bed, her clipboard tucked under her arm. Her sharp eyes softened as she reviewed Clara's chart. "It's remarkable," she said, her voice crisp but warm. She entered a profound hibernation state. Extreme stress and grief dropped her vitals so low we missed them. Duke's persistence saved her. Margaret looked up, her needles pausing. "He knew," she said, her tone reverent. James nodded, his gravelly voice low. "Always did." Dr. Mitchell smiled faintly. "Science can't explain it all, but dogs sense what we can't. She's stable now, improving every day." The news of Clara's survival had swept Ashwood like a wildfire, igniting a transformation that rippled through its quiet streets. At the elementary school, the board convened an emergency meeting, Charles Lawson's face grim as he faced a room of parents once divided. Helen Phillips stood before them, her sharp demeanor humbled, her voice trembling. "We were wrong," she admitted, her hands clasped tight. "Our fear nearly killed her. We need to fix this." The room buzzed. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. But the tide had turned. Policies shifted, drafts penned to balance safety with the emotional needs of students like Clara. Back on Cedar Lane, the Bennetts' rental house stood empty, its lease broken by necessity and grief. But Ashwood hadn't let them fall. Mr. Wilson, their former neighbor, arrived at the hospital with his realtor daughter Jennifer a week after Clara's awakening. "The town's been busy," he said, handing James an envelope. Inside was a deed to a modest house on Maple Street, 3 bedrooms, a fenced yard, no stairs, bought with a community fund. "It's yours," Jennifer added, her smile wide. "Contractors fixed it up, church folks pitched in. You're home." Margaret's tears fell onto the paper. James's hand squeezing hers, their gratitude a silent hymn. The move unfolded with a grace Ashwood hadn't known in years. Church ladies stocked the kitchen with casseroles, high schoolers painted the walls in cheerful yellow, and the local furniture store delivered beds, including a cushioned mat for Duke, placed right beside Clara's. Sarah Mitchell had warned of a slow recovery. Clara's immune system needed time, but Duke's presence sped it along, her vitals strengthening. With each day he stayed near. She'd sit by the window now, not waiting but watching, her sketches of Duke piling up, a testament to a bond unbroken. Edith Carter visited often, her cane tapping a familiar rhythm as she brought Clara new pencils and tales of Ashwood's past. "You're our miracle," she'd say, her silver hair catching the light, her journal now thick with the story she'd lived. She saw the town change. Helen Phillips dismantled her anti-Duke campaign, organizing meal trains instead. Nancy and her friends, guilt-ridden, started a kindness club at school, sharing Clara's tale to mend old wounds. Even Officer Daniel Reese, who'd shadowed Duke's journey, dropped by with a chew toy, his gruff nod a quiet salute to the dog's courage. The hospital halls echoed with Clara's story. Nurses who'd wept at her decline now smiled as she walked short distances, Duke at her heels. Dr. Robert Klein, whose instincts had sparked the miracle, checked in daily, his white hair a familiar sight. 40 years in medicine, he mused, watching Duke guard Clara's steps, and I've never seen anything like this. He's her medicine. The hospital reviewed its protocols, spurred by Clara's case, a ripple of change reaching beyond Ashwood's borders. Outside, the town rallied, Gino's Pizza. Forgave months of rent, the pet store offered Duke-free supplies and collection jars sprouted on counters to ease the Bennetts' medical bills. High schoolers planned a benefit concert, elementary kids sold friendship bracelets, their small hands weaving Clara and Duke into Ashwood's fabric. The insurance company, shamed by the truth, reinstated the Bennetts' policy with a clause for Duke, a quiet victory over the fear that had once ruled. Clara's discharge day loomed, a promise of normalcy after months of chaos. Margaret packed her knitting. James hauled a duffel of Clara's things, and Duke wagged his tail, sensing the shift. The staff lined the halls as Clara walked out, her hand on Duke's back, their steps slow but sure. Outside, the Maple Street house waited, a new beginning rooted in a town reborn. But the story wasn't complete. Clara's voice, quiet now, would soon rise, and Ashwood's lessons would find their final echo in a corner built for healing. The spring morning of April 15th, 2026, bloomed bright over Ashwood, Oregon, the sun casting golden rays across the elementary school's auditorium. Clara Bennett, now 9, stood at the podium, her small hands gripping its edges, her blue eyes shining with a strength reborn. Beside her sat Duke, his German shepherd coat streaked with gray, his proud bearing softened by age but undimmed by time. The room buzzed with anticipation. Students, teachers, parents, and neighbors filled the seats, their faces a tapestry of pride and memory. Today marked the opening of Companion's Corner, a recess haven for therapy animals, born from Clara's story and Ashwood's second chance. Clara's voice, clear and steady, rose above the hum. A year ago I learned that sometimes the greatest love comes with 4 paws and a wagging tail, she began, a smile tugging at her lips. The audience chuckled warmly, many recalling their roles in the journey that brought them here. The pond, the banishment, the miracle at Grace Hill. Duke tilted his head, his brown eyes meeting hers, and she reached down to stroke his fur, a gesture as natural as breathing. This corner's for everyone, she continued, so no one has to lose their best friend like I almost did. James Bennett sat in the front row, his trucker's jacket swapped for a clean shirt, his weathered hands resting on Margaret's. She'd quit the laundromat to run a community outreach program with Dr. Robert Klein's new foundation. Her gentle hands now busy with purpose beyond soap and steam. James drove local routes now, home every night to their Maple Street house, a gift from a town that had rebuilt itself alongside them. Their eyes glistened as Clara spoke, her words a balm for the scars of the past year, her presence a miracle they'd never take for granted. The auditorium walls bore the marks of change. Photos of Duke and other therapy dogs hung beside posters on animal behavior, a testament to Ashwood's new ethos. Nancy Phillips, once Clara's tormentor, now her friend, stood with a student group introducing younger kids to the animals. Her guilt transformed into action. Helen Phillips, seated nearby, nodded quietly, her sharp edges dulled by humility. Her role in the corner's funding a quiet amends. The school board, led by a chastened Charles Lawson, had etched compassion into policy, ensuring no child would suffer as Clara had. Edith Carter sat near the back, her silver hair catching the light, her journal closed on her lap. She'd chronicled it all, the dark days, the desperate runs, the day Duke clawed open a truth no one else saw. Now, as Clara's voice filled the room, Edith smiled, her cane resting beside her, her words complete. They learned from a girl and her dog. She'd written last night that love can mend what fear breaks. She watched the town she'd known for decades, once frayed by division, knit itself whole, its small-town soul shining through. Dr. Klein, retired but ever-present, leaned against a wall, his white hair a quiet beacon. His foundation studied human-animal bonds, Clara and Duke its cornerstone, its findings rippling through Oregon's hospitals. "She's taught us more than we taught her," he'd told Margaret, that morning watching Clara toss a ball to Duke in the Maple Street yard. The research had shifted policies, therapy animals welcomed where they'd once been barred, a legacy born of a dog's unwavering heart. The ceremony ended with applause, a wave of sound that rolled over Clara and Duke as they stepped down. The crowd spilled outside to the playground, where Companion's Corner awaited, a fenced nook with benches, toys, and a sign carved with paw prints. Clara cut the ribbon, her small scissors flashing in the sun, and Duke barked once, a joyful note that echoed through the pines. Kids rushed in, therapy dogs wagging tails, their laughter mingling with the breeze, a sound Ashwood hadn't heard in too long. Back on Maple Street, the Bennett's house stood as a gathering place, its yard often filled with neighbors, its porch swing a nightly ritual. That evening they sat together, Clara nestled against Margaret, Duke at her feet, James's arm around them both. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a quiet beauty that felt earned. Clara's sketches adorned the walls inside, framed by volunteers. Her new journal embossed with paw prints, a gift from classmates who'd once shunned her. She'd written in it that morning, "Duke saved me, and we saved Ashwood." The town had healed in ways big and small. Gino's Pizza hosted fundraisers, the pet store stocked Duke's treats, and the church's fund aided families in crisis. Officer Daniel Reese patrolled with a softer stride, his role in Duke's journey a quiet pride. Nancy's Kindness Club spread to other schools, a ripple of Clara's truth, bullying undone by understanding. Even the insurance company, humbled, sent a plaque honoring Duke, now hung in the Bennetts' living room. As night fell, Edith crossed the street one last time, her cane tapping a farewell. She slipped a note under the door, "You've given us a story for the ages," and turned back, her silhouette fading into the dusk. Clara read it aloud, her voice soft, and Duke thumped his tail, a gentle rhythm against the floor. Margaret hummed a lullaby. James pulled them closer, and the simple joy of being together, safe, whole, settled over them like a blanket. Duke aged gracefully into Ashwood's beloved guardian, his white muzzle a badge of honor, his daily walks with Clara a ritual through the school's front doors. The Companion's Corner thrived, a testament to a bond that defied death, a lesson in loyalty that echoed beyond Oregon's pines. Clara's laughter rang out again, her sketches filled with knights and dogs, and Ashwood stood taller, its heart mended by a girl and her four-pawed savior. The story closed under that spring sky, a tale of love's triumph, sealed with a wag and a smile. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like, and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.